The first thing I heard that morning was a bulldozer eating through the apple trees my daddy had planted with his own hands. The second thing I heard was Calvin Bayard yelling over the engine, "Morning, Nell. Try not to stand too close. We are putting in something that is going to make this county proud." And the third thing, the one that made the coffee turn cold in my hand, was the hard metallic clack of survey stakes being driven into my land. Now this was back in 1995, before everybody carried a telephone in their pocket and filmed every bad decision they ever made before you could hide behind an email and call it communication. Back then, when somebody wanted to steal something from you, they usually had the decency to show up in person. I was 46 years old, freshly divorced, tired down to my bones, and I had come home to Willow Creek, Arkansas, because I thought a month on my late father's farm might settle something in me that the rest of my life had not been able to settle. I'd spent nearly 20 years working in airport safety, most of that time out of the FAA regional office in Fort Worth, where my days were full of weather reports, airspace maps, runway inspections, and men with expensive watches explaining why rules should not apply to them. I had seen little airports get bigger, big airports get uglier, and enough folks nearly kill themselves trying to turn a field into a landing strip with a prayer and a fresh coat of paint. But none of that prepared me for standing in my own orchard, wearing old jeans and my father's faded work boots, watching a bulldozer tear through rows of Arkansas black apple trees like they were weeds. The farm had belonged to my father, Earl Harper, for 42 years. He was not a sentimental man, at least not in the way people usually mean it. He never said he loved you just because it was your birthday. He did not hug much, and when he was proud of you, would usually say something like, "Well, I suppose you did not embarrass yourself." But he loved that land. Every fence post had a story. Every tree had been planted for a reason. The orchard was not much by 1995 standards. Just 30-some acres of old apple trees, a weathered barn, a pond full of loud frogs, and a farmhouse that leaned a little to the left when the wind came in hard from the south. Still, it was ours, or at least it had been his. After he died the previous winter, he left it to me, which surprised just about everybody, including me. My younger brother had moved to Phoenix, my sister had married a dentist in Little Rock, and I was the one who had left first. The one who went to college, got a government job, and spent most of my life being accused of thinking I was too good for Willow Creek. Daddy and I had not had an easy relationship. He never forgave me for leaving the farm, and I never forgave him for acting like leaving meant I stopped loving it. So when I got the call that he had passed in his sleep, I drove down from Texas with a black dress and a garment bag and a knot in my chest that never really went away. I told my boss I needed 4 weeks. I said I had estate matters to handle. That was true. What I did not say was that I needed to stand in that old kitchen one more time, smell the coffee burn too long in the pot, hear the floorboards complain under my feet, and figure out whether my father had loved me more than he had known how to say. That was why I came back. Not for a fight, not for some grand act of justice. I came back because I was tired, and because sometimes the only place you can hear yourself think is the place where you first learned to be quiet. But there I was, 3 days into my so-called peaceful summer, staring at a bulldozer cutting a raw brown scar through the orchard. Calvin Bayard stood 20 yards away in a pale blue short-sleeve shirt, khaki pants, and one of those white cowboy hats that men wear when they want to look successful but do not actually own any cattle. Calvin was president of the Cedar Ridge Property Association, a neighborhood development built on the old Miller Tract just north of my farm. Cedar Ridge had been there about 11 years, long enough for the first wave of young families to become middle-aged and the first wave of promises to become complaints. It had a clubhouse, a pool that leaked every summer, matching mailboxes, and a set of bylaws thick enough to stop a door from closing. Calvin had been in charge the 6 years, which was about 5 years longer than anyone should have been trusted with a clipboard and the ability to fine people for leaving trash cans visible from the street. He had once owned a used car lot outside town, then got into real estate when the lake property boom hit in the late 80s. He knew how to smile when money was involved, and he knew how to make people feel small when it was not. He had always hated my father. That part went back years. Daddy had refused to sell him 12 acres at the edge of the farm when Cedar Ridge was first being planned. Calvin wanted the land for a second entrance road, maybe a few more lots, maybe something else. Daddy told him no. Not because he had a business plan, not because he wanted more money, but because he said he did not trust a man who called every piece of grass a future opportunity. Calvin never forgot that. The first time I saw him that morning, he looked at me like he had been waiting for Daddy to die and for me to show up late. "Morning, Nell," he said again, smiling the way a man smiles when he thinks he has already won. "You picked an interesting week to come home." I stood there with my coffee cup in one hand and watched one of his workers hammer another orange stake into the ground. "What are you building, Cal?" I asked. He spread his arms wide like I had asked him to introduce a new stadium. "Progress." He said it with a little pause, the way some people say, "church." I looked past him at the dirt path carved through the orchard. It ran straight for a long way, more than 2,000 feet if my eyes were right, maybe longer once it reached the pasture. It was too wide for a road, too flat for a drainage ditch, and the stakes were aligned with a precision that made the back of my neck tighten. I had spent too many years looking at runway diagrams not to recognize one when I saw it. "Cal," I said, "what exactly are you building?" He leaned close enough that I could smell the peppermint gum on his breath. "You will hear all about it at the association meeting Friday night. It is going to make Cedar Ridge the finest community in this part of the state." I looked down at the orchard, then back at him. "On my land." Calvin smiled wider. "That is where it gets interesting." Then he walked away, shouting at the men in the bulldozer like he was directing traffic at the county fair. I stood there for a long time after he left. A mourning dove called from the old grain silo. The bulldozer growled. Somewhere behind the house, the screen door banged in the wind. And right in the middle of that noise, I could hear my father saying the thing he used to say whenever I got upset too fast. "Do not let the first fool in the room decide your mood." I hated that advice when I was 16. I hated it when I was 26. But standing there at 46, watching Calvin Baird rip into trees my father had planted before I was born, I knew exactly what Daddy meant. I did not scream. I did not call the sheriff. Not yet. I walked back into the house, set my cold coffee down beside the sink, and pulled the old county plat maps from the cabinet where Daddy kept every important paper in a metal box that used to hold Nabisco crackers. I found the original survey, the deed, the easement documents, the tax map, and a yellowed folder labeled Cedar Ridge in Daddy's blocky handwriting. I spent most of the morning at the kitchen table, reading through pages that smelled like dust, tobacco, and old anger. By noon, I knew two things. First, my land was not part of Cedar Ridge. It never had been. Second, there was an old emergency access easement along the northern fence line, created years before when the land had belonged to the Miller family. The easement was barely 20 feet wide, meant for fire trucks or emergency access if the main road was blocked. It absolutely did not give anybody the right to cut a runway through an orchard. It did not give them the right to grade soil, remove trees, bring in equipment, or turn my father's land into whatever fantasy Calvin had cooked up in his head. That afternoon I drove into town. Willow Creek was one of those places that looked like it had been built slowly and then forgotten on purpose. One stoplight, one gas station, a hardware store with dusty fishing lures in the window, and Mabel Reyes's diner on Main Street, where everybody knew your business before you sat down. Mabel saw me come in and poured coffee before I even asked. "You look like you have been arguing with machinery," she said. "I have," I told her. She slid into the booth across from me, took one look at my face, and lowered her voice. "Calvin started something, did he not?" I did not answer right away. In a town like Willow Creek, silence sometimes said more than a confession. Mabel sat back, sighed, and looked toward the front window. "He has been talking about it for months." Talking about what? A flying community. Private planes, rich buyers from Dallas, fancy little hangars behind people's houses. He has been calling it Cedar Ridge Air Park. I stared at her. "You're kidding. I wish I was." He's had brochures made. Some man from Kansas City came down twice to look at the property. Calvin says this place is going to be the next big thing. I put my hand around my coffee mug and felt my fingers tighten. He is building a runway through my orchard. Mabel's face changed then. Not surprise, exactly. More like somebody had just confirmed the worst thing she already suspected. Well, she said, "That is a mighty bold thing to do," before asking the owner. I laughed once, but there was no humor in it. You know Calvin. Asking is not really his style. Mabel leaned forward. "Nell, people in Cedar Ridge are scared. Some of them think he is going to save their property values. Others think he is going to ruin them, and the few of them are just tired of him telling them what color they can paint their front doors." I looked out the window at the old courthouse across the street. The flag snapped in the warm Arkansas wind. A man in overalls was loading feed bags into a pickup. Two little boys rode bicycles past the diner with baseball cards clipped to their spokes. Nothing in that town had changed very much since I left, except me. I had been gone so long that I had forgotten how quickly a small place could turn a rumor into a battle line. I drove back to the farm before sunset. The bulldozers had stopped for the day, but the damage was easy to see. 6 apple trees were down. One had split clean through the trunk, its roots ripped out of the soil like something torn open in surgery. I walked the length of the cleared strip until I reached the pasture. The route was obvious now. It cut through the orchard, crossed the field, and ended near the tree line by the pond. It was long enough for a small plain. Barely. Too close to the county road. Too close to the power lines. Too close to the hill on the west side. The approach was wrong. The drainage was wrong. The wind pattern was wrong. Everything about it screamed that somebody had looked at pictures of private air parks in a glossy magazine and figured grass and asphalt were all it took. I stood there in the red evening light, looking at the place where my father used to park his tractor, and for the first time since arriving home, I let myself say it out loud. Calvin Bayard had no idea who he was dealing with. Part 2. The Midel. Friday night, the Cedar Ridge Association meeting was held in the clubhouse, a low brick building behind the pool that smelled like burnt coffee, floor wax, and somebody's leftover potato salad. I had been invited by letter, though invited was a generous word. The envelope was tucked under my door with no stamp, no greeting, and a typed message that said, "Landowner attendance strongly advised." I almost stayed home. Part of me wanted to lock the gate, call a lawyer, and let paperwork do the talking. That was the part of me that had spent too many years in government offices, watching people turn everything into a stack of files. But another part of me, the part that was still Daddy's daughter no matter how far I had traveled, wanted to look Calvin in the face and make him explain why he thought he could walk across a dead man's land like it belonged to him. So I went. I wore jeans, boots, and a plain white shirt. No blazer, no badge, no hint of where I worked or what I knew. When I walked into the room, conversations got quieter. People knew why I was there. Some looked embarrassed. A few looked nervous. Calvin stood at the front beside a folding table covered with maps, color brochures, and a wooden model of what looked like a tiny airport built by somebody with too much time and not enough sense. He smiled when he saw me. "Miss Harper," he said, "glad you could make it. I took a seat in the back. Would not miss it." The meeting started with the usual nonsense. Pool maintenance, parking complaints, a motion about basketball hoops visible from the street. Then Calvin cleared his throat and put both hands on the table like he was about to announce a moon landing. "As many of you know," he said, "Cedar Ridge has an opportunity to become a premier residential community in the region." He flipped over a large poster. It showed neat little homes, small hangars, a paved runway, and an airplane flying under a perfect blue sky. Across the top were the words Cedar Ridge Air Park. Underneath, in smaller letters, "Live where the sky begins." I almost admired the nerve of it. It looked like something printed by a man who had never seen a real runway, never smelled jet fuel, never stood beside a wrecked airplane and wished somebody had taken safety seriously before it was too late. Calvin talked about property values, executive buyers, access to major cities, new investment, prestige. He said the runway would bring opportunity to Willow Creek. He said it would put Cedar Ridge on the map. He said the association had voted 68% in favor of the project. Then he turned toward me and smiled. Of course, a small portion of the route crosses the Harper property, but as our legal review has shown, the existing emergency easement provides the necessary access. I stood up slowly. I had brought the deed in a manila folder, along with the survey map Daddy had kept for 20 years. I held it up. "This emergency easement is 20 feet wide," I said. "It is for emergency access. It does not give you the right to clear trees, pour asphalt, or land airplanes in my pasture." Calvin did not even blink. "Nell, nobody is trying to take anything from you. We are trying to build something that benefits the whole community. You're cutting down my orchard. We had to remove a few trees to begin grading. You had to remove nothing." He sighed, the way men sigh when a woman is being inconvenient in public. "You've been gone a long time. Things change. Daddy bought that land before your subdivision existed." I said it louder than I meant to. His face tightened. A man in the front row shifted in his chair. A woman near the coffee pot looked down at her hands. Calvin leaned toward me. Earl Harper fought progress his whole life now. Maybe it is time somebody in your family stopped treating the future like an enemy. That one got under my skin because it was not entirely wrong. Daddy had fought a lot of things. He fought the county when they wanted to widen the road. He fought the bank when they wanted to refinance the farm. He fought me when I left for college. But Calvin did not know the difference between being stubborn and being careful. Daddy had not hated progress. He hated people who wanted to use progress as an excuse to take what was not theirs. I walked to the front of the room and laid the deed beside Calvin's glossy brochure. "Let me make this simple," I said. "You can hold all the votes you want. You can print all the brochures you want. You can call it progress until your face turns blue, but a property association cannot vote itself onto private land." Calvin's smile faded a little. Then he said, and I will never forget it, "You should be careful, Nell. You are one person standing in the way of a lot of people who want a better life." I looked him straight in the eye. "No, Cal. I am one person standing in the way of a man who thinks he gets to decide what everybody else loses." For a second, the room went quiet. Then Calvin slapped his palm on the table. "The association has approved this project. The construction is proceeding, and if you interfere, we will pursue every option available to us. Fine me, threaten me, sue me," I said. "But you are not building an airport through my father's farm." I walked out before he could answer. Outside, the summer air felt heavy and warm. I sat in my truck for a while with my hands on the steering wheel. I was angry, but underneath the anger was something else. Fear, maybe. Not fear of Calvin exactly. I had dealt with men like him for years. The kind who mistook confidence for authority and loudness for truth. What scared me was how easily people had believed him. There were families in that room who were struggling. People who had bought houses in Cedar Ridge thinking it would be their final move, then watched factory jobs disappear, watched their savings shrink, watched their kids leave for bigger cities. Calvin had found the right words for their fears. He had promised them a way out, and people will forgive a lot when they think somebody is offering them hope. The next morning, I found the first notice tag to my front door. It was from Cedar Ridge Property Association, even though my land was not part of Cedar Ridge. It said I was obstructing a community development corridor by leaving farm equipment near the construction zone. In plain English, they were threatening to fine me because my father's old tractor was parked in my own field. I read it twice, laughed once, then used it to start the wood stove, even though it was too hot outside for a fire. By Monday, there was a second notice, then a third. One claimed my fence violated development standards. Another said my gate created a safety hazard. One afternoon, I came home from a hardware store and found orange cones blocking my driveway. I sat there in the truck for a minute, looking at those bright plastic cones like they had somehow become the official symbol of Calvin Bayard's entire personality. Then I put the truck in low gear and pushed them aside one by one. I did not hit them hard. I did not need to. Watching them tumble down the gravel was satisfaction enough. The worst part was the noise. The workers started before sunrise. By 6 in the morning, the bulldozers were growling, trucks were backing up, and dust was drifting over the orchard like a dirty fog. My old dog, Pepper, would hide under the porch. The chickens stopped laying for a few days. The windows in the farmhouse rattled so hard I thought one might come loose from the frame. And every so often, Calvin would drive by in his black Lincoln, slow down near the gate, and wave at me through the window like we were neighbors passing on a Sunday afternoon. I wanted to throw something at that car. I am not proud of it, but there were several mornings when a ripe apple would have made a very convincing argument. Instead, I kept my mouth shut and started taking notes. That was when my niece Lila arrived. She was 17, smart as a whip, and had spent the whole summer bouncing between relatives because her mother, my sister, was working double shifts at the hospital in Little Rock. Lila showed up with a duffel bag, a stack of cassette tapes, and one of those bulky Panasonic camcorders she had borrowed from the school media department. She had dyed the underside of her hair purple, which Daddy would have pretended to hate, though I knew he would have bragged about her to everyone at the feed store. "Aunt Nell," she said, stepping out of the car. "Mom says I am supposed to stay with you until she gets some breathing room. I hope you do not mind." I looked at the bulldozer chewing through the field behind her. "Honey," I said, "you picked a strange summer to visit?" She followed my eyes, watched the work crew for a second, then looked back at me. "Is that man building an airport in the orchard? That is what he thinks he's doing." Lila set down her bag. "Well, he looks like the kind of man who would get beat up by a fax machine." I laughed harder than I had in weeks. After that, Lila became part of the investigation without ever calling it one. She filmed the trucks coming in before daylight. She filmed workers cutting trees. She filmed the signs Calvin put up along the fence that said future home of Cedar Ridge Air Park, private access only. She filmed him standing beside the graders, telling a group of potential buyers that they were looking at a once-in-a-lifetime investment. I still remember one afternoon when Calvin brought 3 men in golf shirts and a woman wearing pearls out to the construction site. Lila had climbed into the old hayloft with the camcorder and caught nearly every word through a crack in the barn wall. Calvin said, "By next spring, you will be able to fly from Dallas and have your wheels on the ground right behind your house." One of the men asked whether the runway had been cleared by the FAA. Calvin laughed. "We have all the paperwork we need." That was the first time I knew he had crossed from arrogance into something much worse. I knew the paperwork. I knew what forms existed, what reviews mattered, what notices had to be filed, and what questions had to be answered before any serious aviation project could even pretend to be legitimate. I also knew that a private landing strip was not as simple as calling Washington and asking permission. Aviation law was complicated, and people who did not understand it often made the mistake of thinking that meant there were no rules. There were rules. They just were not always the kind you could see from a distance. Airspace reviews, obstruction studies, state registration, county permits, landowner consent, approach paths, drainage, surface safety, emergency access, and the biggest rule of all was the one Calvin had ignored from the beginning. You do not get to build on somebody else's land because you printed a brochure with a little airplane on it. That night, after Lila went to bed, I sat at Daddy's kitchen table with a lamp turned low. The bulldozers had gone quiet, but the silence did not feel peaceful yet. I spread the evidence across the table. Photos, VHS tapes, notices from the property association, copies of the old easement. A brochure one of the Cedar Ridge residents had slipped under my door. It promised priority hangar placement for early investors and listed a $5,000 Sky Club membership fee. $5,000 in 1995 was not pocket change. That was money people save for a new roof, a college fund, a truck that would start in winter. Calvin was not just trying to build a runway. He was selling pieces of a dream he did not own. I stared at the papers for a long time, then opened the old desk drawer where Daddy kept the telephone book. I found the number for the FAA office in Fort Worth, even though I knew it by heart. I sat there with my finger on the button for nearly a minute. Calling my office felt like admitting something. It meant this was not just family business anymore. It meant I could not handle it quietly. It meant my father's farm was about to become a case file. Finally, I picked up the receiver. The line clicked, then rang. My friend Howard Clay answered on the 4th ring. Howard had been in airport safety longer than I had. He was the sort of man who could explain wind shear using a napkin and a salt shaker and complain about airport coffee for 10 straight minutes. "Nell," he said, "is this a social call or am I about to lose sleep?" I took a breath. "I have a private development trying to build a runway on land they do not own." There was a pause. "You are kidding." I wish I was. "Do they have a filed airspace review?" "Not that I can find." "State approval?" "No." "County grading permit?" "No." "Landowner consent?" I laughed without humor. "You tell me." Howard was quiet for a second. Then he said, "Send me everything. Fax it. Mail the tapes if you have to. And now, do not touch anything. Do not confront them alone. Let the paperwork do its job." I hung up, looked at the old fax machine sitting on the counter, and thought about how funny it was that something so small could make a man like Calvin Baird nervous. A few pages of paper, a few signatures, a few facts he could not talk his way around. The next week moved fast. I drove to the county courthouse and found out Calvin had not filed for the construction permit he claimed to have. The county clerk, a woman named Rosa Bell who had known me since I wore pigtails, showed me the records herself. There was no permit for the grading, no permit for the road crossing, no permit for the drainage work. There was, however, a document Calvin had filed that made my stomach turn. It was a revised copy of the old emergency easement, altered to make it look wider than it was. The ink was different. The type was wrong. And the signature at the bottom looked enough like Daddy's handwriting to fool someone who had never seen him sign his name, but not enough to fool me. My father made his capital E with a long lower stroke, like a fishing hook. The signature on that document did not have it. I stood there in Rosa's office with the paper in my hands and felt something inside me go very still. He forged my father's name. Rosa saw my face. "Is it bad?" I looked at her. It is worse than bad. That evening I drove to Mabel's diner, found a payphone beside the restrooms, and called Howard again. The phone booth smelled like cigarette smoke and lemon cleaner. I told him what I found. He did not joke this time. You need a lawyer. I already have one. You do? My father did not trust developers, I said. He trusted one lawyer in town. I called him this morning. The lawyer was a man named Warren Pike, 71 years old, sharp as a knife, and built like a sack of flour. He had handled Daddy's farm papers for years. He had known Calvin when Calvin was still selling used Buicks out by the highway. When I showed him the altered easement, he took off his glasses, looked at it for 30 seconds and said, "Well, I will be damned." Then he looked up at me. That boy finally got greedy enough to get stupid. Warren moved fast. He filed for an emergency injunction to stop the construction. He filed a trespass action. He notified the county. Howard coordinated with the state aviation office and brought in an FAA airspace specialist from Dallas to review the proposed site. The findings came back exactly the way I expected. The runway had no completed airspace safety review. The approach path conflicted with power lines in a nearby county road. The site had no verified drainage plan. It did not meet the state requirements for an approved landing field. And the construction had been built on disputed private property using what appeared to be a forged easement. On paper, Calvin's dream was already dead, but he did not know it yet. Or maybe he sensed it and decided to run faster, because 2 days later, every mailbox in Cedar Ridge received a glossy flyer. Grand opening celebration, it said. Cedar Ridge Air Park. Saturday, July 15th, 1995. Ribbon cutting, champagne reception, first demonstration flight. I read that flyer standing in my driveway as the evening sun dropped behind the trees. Lila came out of the house with a glass of sweet tea and looked over my shoulder. "He is actually going to land a plane there," she said. "That is what he is planning. Is he allowed to do that?" "Not if I can stop it." Lila looked at me. "Are you going to tell everybody who you are?" I looked across the field at the half-finished strip of dirt and gravel, at the signs, at the men working late under portable lights. I kept my FAA job quiet because I did not want anybody in Willow Creek treating me differently. I did not want to be the woman from Washington or the government lady or Earl Harper's daughter who came back acting smarter than everybody else. But Calvin had mistaken quiet for weakness. He had mistaken grief for distraction. And he had mistaken a tired woman in work boots for somebody he could move out of the way. Maybe I had let him believe that for too long. I looked at Lila and said, "Not yet." Part 3. The ending. The morning of the grand opening came in hot and bright, the kind of Arkansas July day when the air already feels tired before breakfast. By 9 o'clock, cars were lined up along the road outside Cedar Ridge. Pickup trucks, Cadillacs, station wagons, a few shiny luxury cars from out of town. Someone had put up white folding chairs beside the runway. There were red, white, and blue balloons tied to the temporary fence. A local television crew from Channel 8 had a camera on a tripod near the clubhouse. Calvin had hired a country band from Pine Bluff to play for the crowd, though they seemed confused about why they were setting up beside a dirt strip in the middle of somebody else's orchard. He'd even put out champagne, which felt like a strange choice for a man who had never successfully completed anything except a sentence about himself. I dressed plain that morning, faded jeans, brown boots, blue denim shirt, the same kind of clothes Calvin expected me to wear. I did not want to look important. I wanted him to look at me and see exactly what he had always seen, a woman standing in the way of his plans. My FAA identification was tucked inside my shirt pocket. The court order was in a folder under my arm. Warren Pike was waiting near the road with the sheriff. Howard had driven down from Texas with the FAA airspace specialist, and the state aviation inspector was parked behind a county cruiser. Nobody was there for a show. We were there because a man had scheduled an aircraft demonstration over an unsafe, unapproved landing strip built on stolen ground. And because sometimes the only way to stop a liar is to let him tell the lie, one last time in front of everybody he fooled. Lila stood beside me near the old barn with her camcorder. Her hands were shaking a little. "You okay?" I asked. She nodded. "I am fine. I just hope that man does not fall over when you tell him." I looked at her and smiled. "Me too, honey." Calvin walked onto a small wooden platform near the ribbon at about 10:30. He wore a dark suit even though it was nearly 90 degrees, a white hat, and the kind of grin that told you he had practiced in a mirror. Behind him, a banner read, "Welcome to Cedar Ridge Air Park." The crowd clapped as he lifted a microphone. "Folks," he began, "today is a proud day for this community. For too long, Willow Creek has watched opportunity pass us by. For too long, we have been told to settle for what we have. But today, we take a step forward. Today, we become part of the future." People applauded, some because they believed him, some because they had paid money and desperately wanted to believe him, some because it was easier to clap than to admit they were standing in the middle of a mistake. Calvin talked about property values. He talked about businessmen flying in from Dallas and Little Rock. He talked about new restaurants, new jobs, new families, new money. He did not mention the orchard. He did not mention my father. He did not mention the forged document. And he sure did not mention that his own company had taken deposits for hangar spaces that did not legally exist. Then he raised his hand toward the sky. Right on cue, a small Beechcraft appeared in the distance, circling low over the tree line. The crowd turned and looked up. Children pointed. Somebody cheered. Calvin stood there under the banner with both arms open, like he had personally invented aviation. That was when I started walking. At first nobody noticed me. Then people began whispering. Calvin saw me when I was about 20 feet from the platform. His smile stiffened. "Nell," he said into the microphone, "this is not the time." I kept walking. The plane circled again, lower this time. Calvin stepped down from the platform and came toward me. I said, "This is not the time." I stopped in front of him. "Actually, Cal," I said, "this is exactly the time." He looked at the folder under my arm, then at the sheriff standing near the road. His face changed, just slightly. But I saw it. It was the first crack. "What is this?" he asked. I pulled my identification from my pocket and held it where the crowd could see. "My name is Eleanor Harper," I said. "I work in airport safety for the Federal Aviation Administration." A wave of sound moved through the crowd. Not loud, not at first, more like a breath pulled in by 50 people at once. Calvin stared at the badge. He knew what it meant. Not because I had some magical power to shut down the world with a wave of my hand, but because it meant he had spent the last month lying to somebody who understood every inch of his lie. I held up the court order. "This property is privately owned. The easement you used has been altered. The county has issued a stop work order. The State Aviation Office has found no approved landing field registration for this site, and the FAA has no completed safety or airspace review for the runway you are trying to open today." Calvin grabbed for the folder. I pulled it back. "You cannot do this," he said, but his voice had lost the smoothness it carried 5 minutes earlier. I looked toward the runway. The Beechcraft was turning onto final approach. "Yes," I said, "I can." The sheriff stepped forward, lifted a portable radio, and spoke to the airport manager who had been in contact with the pilot. The pilot banked hard before reaching the field. The engines rose in a sharp roar as the plane climbed away from the trees and turned back toward the municipal airport. The crowd gasped. Several people covered their ears. The red ribbon snapped in the wind from the plane's wake. I will never forget that sound. It was not just an airplane climbing away. It was Calvin's whole fantasy lifting off without him. He stood there staring at the sky, then turned back to me with his face red and wet with sweat. "This is a misunderstanding," he said. "We have investors, we have association approval, we have signed agreements. You have brochures," I said. "You have deposits. You have a forged easement and an unsafe strip built on land you do not own. That is not approval. That is a mess." The Channel 8 camera was pointed straight at us. Leela was filming from the side. Warren Pike stood behind the sheriff with his hands folded over his cane, looking happier than I had ever seen him. Calvin tried to recover. He pointed toward the crowd. "These people want this. They voted for it." A woman near the front stood up. Her name was June Pruitt, a retired teacher who lived across from the Cedar Ridge pool. She had been quiet at the association meeting. Now she looked at Calvin like she had finally gotten tired of being polite. "You told us it was approved," she said. "You told us my grandson could learn to fly here." Calvin turned toward her. "June, please," another man shouted from the back. "You took my deposit. You said the hangar space was guaranteed." Calvin raised his hands. "Folks, listen to me. This is a technical issue. We can fix it." "No," I said. "You cannot fix stealing land. You cannot fix lying to your neighbors. And you cannot fix safety after somebody gets hurt." That landed harder than I expected. The crowd went quiet. There were people in that group who had lost money, People who had believed in Calvin because they were lonely or scared or tired of watching their town get smaller every year. I did not blame them for wanting hope. I blamed the man who had wrapped hope in a ribbon and tried to sell it back to them. The sheriff stepped beside Calvin and told him he needed to come down to the station for questioning about the altered easement and the financial documents. Calvin laughed once, too loudly. He said this was all political. He said I was using my government job to settle an old family score. Maybe some people believed him. Maybe a part of him believed it too. But when he looked at me, I saw something underneath the anger. Fear. Not fear of me. Fear of being seen clearly. He leaned close and whispered, "Your father would have hated this." I looked at him for a long second. Then I said, "My father would have hated the runway. He would have hated the lies. And he would have hated that I had to stand here and clean up a mess you made because you thought grief made me weak." Calvin's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The sheriff took his arm, not rough, not dramatic, just firm enough to make it clear the day had moved on without him. As he walked away, the crowd parted. Nobody clapped at first. Then somebody did. It was June Pruitt. One clap, then another, then a few more. Soon the applause rolled across the field, not wild and joyful exactly, but relieved, like people had been holding their breath for a month and finally remembered how to let it go. I stood there with the badge still in my hand and felt something loosen inside me. The orchard was still damaged. The trees were still gone. There would be lawyers, paperwork, cleanup, and long arguments in rooms with bad coffee. But the plane had not landed. The runway was closed. The bulldozers were silent, and for the first time since I came home, I could hear the wind moving through the remaining branches. The months after that were not simple. Real life rarely is. Calvin was removed as president of the Cedar Ridge Property Association after an emergency vote. Some residents wanted him gone immediately. Others said he had meant well. There were arguments at the clubhouse, arguments at the grocery store, arguments in the parking lot outside church. A few people said I had humiliated him publicly. A few said I should have stopped him quietly, instead of waiting until the grand opening. Maybe they had a point. I have thought about that more than once. There is a thin line between justice and revenge, and if you are not careful, you can cross it without noticing. But I knew one thing for sure. If I had stopped him quietly, he would have called himself a victim. He would have blamed the government, blamed me, blamed the county, blamed anybody except the man in the mirror. By stopping him in front of the people he had lied to, I gave them the truth in the same place he had sold them the fantasy. The court eventually ruled the easement document invalid. The county ordered the construction removed. The association was left with bills they had not expected, angry investors, and a lot of residents asking why nobody had questioned Calvin sooner. The runway was never finished. Crews came out later that fall and hauled away the gravel. The broken ground was leveled. I hired a local man named Otis to help me replant the orchard. We put in young apple trees where the old ones had been cut down. They looked too small at first, thin little things standing in fresh soil, but that is how most recovery begins. Small, quiet, easy to miss if you were only looking for dramatic endings. Lila went back to Little Rock before school started. On her last night at the farm, we sat on the porch and watched fireflies rise over the pasture. She had the camcorder beside her, and Pepper was asleep with his head on a bush. "Aunt Now," she said, "do you think Cal really believed he was helping people?" I looked out at the dark field where the runway had almost been. I thought about his speeches, his brochures, his white hat. The way he said progress like it was a prayer. "Maybe," I said. "I think people like Calvin sometimes start out believing their own stories. Then somewhere along the way, they decide the story matters more than the truth." Leela nodded. "That is sad." "It is," I said. "But sad does not make it right." That winter I came back to the farm again. Not because I had to. Because I wanted to. I spent Christmas in the old house with a small tree in the living room and my father's battered radio playing country music low in the background. I walked through the orchard one cold morning and saw the young trees covered in frost. I thought about Daddy then, about all the things we never said, about all the time I spent thinking he did not understand me. Maybe he did. Maybe leaving the farm had never meant I left it behind. Maybe I had been carrying it with me all those years, through airports and hotel rooms, through my marriage, through every job I ever took that required me to act like I was not homesick. I still work in aviation. I still believe rules matter, especially the ones written in blood after somebody ignored common sense. But I learned something that summer that I did not learn in any office or on any runway inspection or in any training manual. Sometimes the most important thing you can protect is not a job, a title, or a piece of paper. Sometimes it is the place where your family left their fingerprints. Sometimes it is the truth, even when telling it makes you unpopular. And sometimes it is your own voice, especially after years of letting other people decide what kind of person you are supposed to be. So now I want to ask you something. Was I right to stop Calvin the way I did in front of his investors, his neighbors, and the television cameras? Or should I have handled it quietly behind closed doors and spared him the public fall? And what do you think about the people in Cedar Ridge who supported him? Were they victims of a man who knew how to sell a dream, or were they responsible for believing something too good to be true? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because in every town, in every family, and in every neighborhood, there is usually somebody like Calvin Bayard, somebody who calls their own ambition progress and expects everybody else to pay the price. And if you have ever had to stand up to someone who thought they were above the rules, share your story too. I would like to hear it.